This is the 64th episode of the Effective Executive podcast and YouTube channel. And this week I want to cover playing the zero sum game. And like everybody else during Thanksgiving week, you probably watch some football, some basketball, whatever sport that happened to be on TV. And it got me thinking about the differences between organizations and in sports versus ones that are trying to make money. And in many organizations, you have former athletes, so a lot of this thinking around win, lose, and everything is prevalent. Matter of fact, I would have to say, most organizations have a series of people in there that have athletes in there, and they take this kind of organizations as a place typically for one winner and one or more losers, because in a football game, one team wins, one team loses, and that's the way it plays out. But this thinking that starts to carry over into companies that these athletes work for, or even this mentality that goes into organizations. And so there's always this kind of, my department won, your department lost. You beat the competition, the company wins, employees lose. And this is one of the things that executives need to not only guard against, but treat completely differently when they're in these organizations. And what happens is, when you have this mentality of zero sum, is the tendency is to overlook potential win-win types of situations. So in other words, if the focus really needs to be on your organization, your system that you work in, then the system needs to win. So things like I've seen in especially large organizations, this happens. It rotates through and comes back all the time, is treating individual departments as profit centers. And I've got multiple stories from organizations I worked with where each department has to make money. Human resources, finance, how do you make money? It just doesn't make sense. There are certain activities that are done for particular departments that really can add value to the customer, and there are others that are purely support. IT cannot show a profit. It can only support the activities that are going on in an organization, of course, unless of course your company does software or something to that effect. Then obviously the software becomes the focus, and that's where the value is created. But the system needs to win over any department, any team, any individual, and this is true for your team also. As an executive, or even if you're an aspiring executive, you probably see some of this stuff going on around you, where people are fighting over what seem to be limited resources, and they need more for their particular department. But the focus needs to really be, and one of the things that you'll find throughout all of my videos and podcasts is that the system needs to be the one that wins, not you as an individual or your particular department. The rest of that other stuff will come along, but stay away from this mentality around individual profit centers and this zero sum thinking game that goes on in organizations. And even you can look for cooperation with your competition. Constantly, one of the biggest factors for General Motors and Ford and Chrysler back in the 70s was the fact that they all were fighting over the same piece of pie, and they didn't really adjust the piece of pie, and the Japanese came along in the 70s and came up with something better as far as types of cars and things of that sort. So rather than fighting over a set pie, how do competition in the case of General Motors and Ford and Chrysler should have been looking for ways to cooperate and grow the pie. What other things can we do in our industry in order to make the pie bigger rather than fighting over a small portion? Then somebody comes along and completely wipes you out because you weren't paying attention. So that was the message I wanted to communicate this week, is this zero-sum thinking game. Like I said, it's born, especially in the United States, out of this, well, it's all over the world. I mean, even in soccer or football, as it's called in other countries, you have a winner and you have a loser. But that isn't the mentality they need to be taking into organizations. That's what I wanted to cover this week. Catch you next week.